We're now pleased to introduce Dr. Nicole Tichenor Blackstone, who is an assistant professor in the Division of Agriculture, Food, and the Environment at the Friedman School for Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. Nicole's research spans food system sustainability at the local and regional level, including various strategies to improve sustainability. And Nicole, I will note that when I got home from the conference yesterday, I had this waiting for me in the mailbox from Tufts Nutrition, and it talks all about entrepreneurship to improve the food system, as well as a really great article on big data and all of the different ways in which we're using information to understand how we can make food system improvements towards sustainable diets. So I know your research and interest will be right on target. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I am honored to be here today. As Kate shared, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the role of local and regional food systems in sustainable diets. But first, I have a confession to make to you. So when I was tasked with this topic, I really could not figure out what to talk about, which I know is a common problem. But I think it really stems from a fundamental issue in our field. So I have done regional food systems research, and I've done sustainable diets research. And when I think about sustainable diets research, if I can move the cursor, there we go. When I think about sustainable diets research, I think about analyses like this. So this is a paper that's forthcoming actually tomorrow in the Lancet Planetary Health, where myself and other colleagues compared the environmental impacts of the dietary guidelines, the most recent dietary guidelines for Americans, looking at the 3 different diet patterns. And so when I think about sustainable diets research, I think about this. And I don't necessarily just think about the environment, but I think about the resource use and emissions associated with it. And I think about social and environmental costs too, and how we can ameliorate those social and environmental and economic costs, which I think is very different from what folks that do local and regional food systems work do. And I think this underlies 3 different perspectives in this space on sustainable food systems that Tara Garnett astutely put forward in 2014. So the first perspective is demand restraint. This is what Marty was talking about and what we've been hearing a lot about, how we can shift diets, how we can influence consumer behavior to reduce the environmental, social, and economic costs of what we produce and consume. The second perspective is efficiency oriented. This is really what Frank was getting at, right? So how can we use technology and innovation to reduce the environmental and social and economic impacts of agriculture and the related supply chains? But there's a third perspective, which is what Tara calls food systems transformation. So the central argument of this perspective is that the problems that we face, the kind of externalities that we face in the food system, are the result of social and economic organization of the food system, rather than just technical problems or the result of individual decisions. It's really a systems perspective on sustainability in the food system. And so I think folks that really work in the local and regional food system space kind of think of themselves as food systems transformers. They are working on alternative ways of organizing supply chains and farming in this kind of vein to think about how we can transform the structure of the food system. So I think that's really where the disconnect comes from, and I'm bringing this perspective into the room in hopes that we can kind of continue these conversations and hopefully bring more folks like sociologists and folks in the humanities into the room to think about how this lens can contribute further to the conversation. So getting back to kind of the meat of my talk, so when we talk about local and regional, what are we actually talking about? It's complicated is the overarching theme here. There's no one definition. Something that's very that's threaded throughout all of them is this connection to geography. In some cases, it's distance, it's a mileage radius. In some cases, it's state-based. There's no concrete definition. Other ways to define local or regional are by marketing channel. This is how USDA defines local or regional. So one marketing channel is direct to consumer, so farms selling directly to consumers in farmers markets or farm stands or community-supported agriculture endeavors. The other channel is intermediated. So this would be farms selling to institutions or retailers or regional distributors or entities called food hubs, which I'll talk about in a second. So these are kind of the two marketing channels that USDA collects some data on for us to understand trends in local and regional. Another dimension of what we could think about as local and regional are the perceived attributes, emphasis on perceived here. So lots of advocates and folks who are really enthusiastic about local food sometimes wrap up perceived attributes into the definition of what is local or regional. So these could include things like improved food quality or safety, automatically being sourced from small-scale farms, being fairer, being more just, or being better for the environment. And I'm not saying that these things are true. I'm just putting these out there as things that often get conflated with local or regional that we should investigate empirically. And just to point out, regional is also in here. It includes local, but it's typically at a larger scale. So when I've done regional food systems work, I've been working at the scale of the northeastern United States. So that's a 12-state region stretching down from West Virginia all the way up to Maine. So regional can have various instantiations too. Oh, how do I go back? Does anybody know how to go back? There we go. Thank you, tech support. So what's the state of local and regional in the United States? So all of my work pretty specifically focuses in this country, just to be clear. But this is kind of the state of the sector. So approximately 8% of farms are using these different marketing channels. And total local and regional food sales are about $6 billion. That's a little bit less than 2% of U.S. agricultural sales. So this is a small fraction of the food system, just to be clear. Most local and regional foods are sold through intermediated channels as opposed to farmers markets. And about half of local and regional foods are produce, and 30% are animal products. So both parts of the food system that are highly relevant for our discussions on sustainable diets. So how might these systems contribute to sustainable diets, given kind of the disconnect that I mentioned earlier? So I'll go through three different domains. The first two more rapidly, just to give you a sense of what possible contributions could be, and the third more thoroughly, because that's where I situate my work. So in terms of economic viability, I wanted to focus on farms. So we know from research that farms working in local supply chains versus mainstream chains, there have been lots of case studies done, can have higher net revenue. And we also know that farms that use direct marketing channels have higher survival rates. And what survival rate means is that these farms have positive sales over time. And it's actually a fairly low rate of farms in the US have positive sales over time. So this chart here is from the Economic Research Service. On the left-hand side, we have farms that don't have any direct sales, and on the right-hand side, we have farms with direct sales. And something to note is that across scales, these are different scale categories from very small to mid-scale and large. These farms have higher survival rates, and this is for all operations and beginning farmers, which is a really critical category when we talk about sustainability in agriculture, because we have an aging farmer population and we need to keep folks on the land. So these are promising marketing opportunities for farms and for economic viability. Another aspect of viability, for small and mid-scale producers, these folks are often locked out of mainstream markets, of large-scale retail and global markets, because they do not have the scale. Sometimes they can't meet quality or consistency requirements to tap into those markets. And so these systems allow different kinds of producers, smaller and mid-scale producers, to be viable. And I wanted to introduce this concept of food hubs. So now in the United States, there are 302, can someone put that back? I'm sorry, this clicker is funky. There are 302 food hubs in the United States. These are entities that aggregate market, and distribute source-identified food. They often have a values-based mission to support small and mid-scale farms. The graphic on the right-hand side is from the National Food Hub Report, talking about how different food hubs are, mission-driven, trying to support farmers, sourcing from small and mid-scale farms, really contributing to economic viability for these operations. Moving on to access and health very quickly. So thinking about fruits and vegetables in particular, we have some evidence at the national scale that produce prices for select commodities like tomatoes and potatoes and some other foods may be lower at farmers markets throughout seasons than compared to retail outlets. And this includes superstores in a lot of cases. So produce prices may actually be lower, which is a dimension of access. It's not access in its entirety. Farmers markets, you also have to make a dedicated trip. And have to have the time to go do that, and motivation to go do that. So it's not a end-all be-all for access, but I just wanted to point out there may be some price benefits. And also there's emerging evidence that local food interventions like farm to school and other kind of complex interventions that put together lots of different factors like gardens and nutrition education and taste tests and changing food in schools have shown some modest benefits on increasing fruit and vegetable consumption and improving willingness to try and acceptability of different fruits and vegetables. So if we're thinking about sustainable diets and we're thinking about how to get folks to eat healthier plant-based foods, there's some emerging evidence that these systems might have something to contribute there. Now I'm focusing on the environment. I'll go through three different aspects. Transportation, a case study I've done in the Northeast with beef, actually, just to tie everything together here, and then a system level issue to talk about produce. So transportation, very quickly. We know that in some cases, transportation, the footprint of transportation increases with local supply chains. It's because local supply chains can have lower fuel efficiency per unit product. There are cases in which regional food may offer advantages here in terms of aggregation and scale. At the same time, I just want to be clear that transportation and food miles are a very small part of the overall footprint of foods in general. So worrying about food miles and worrying about transportation, while it's important in some cases, like with air freight for some commodities, it's generally a very small part. And this is what a lot of research on the ecological benefits of local food has been about. It's really been focused on food miles. So I'll just point this out that this is about 5% of transportation in this estimation of weekly household greenhouse gas emissions by supply chain stage. It's 5% of the total emissions, with emissions really be centering on farming and manufacturing of foods. So let's forget food miles for a little while. I might get called out on the internet for saying that. Let's focus on some other things. So I've done some work in the northeastern United States looking at alternative beef production systems. There is tremendous interest in local meat in the Northeast, for better or for worse. In this region, we also have a culturally and economically significant dairy sector. It's a real mainstay of our economy and our culture. And what's interesting about dairy is that it's a multifunctional system, right? So the dairy sector produces milk and beef. And because it's multifunctional, from a life cycle perspective, beef that comes out of dairy systems, and in particular beef that comes out of these regional dairy systems, has a lower footprint than other systems we might be using in the Northeast, like a grass-based beef production. Frank mentioned, the methane emissions associated with grass-based beef. And I also found that these regional dairy beef systems have a lower land use than a conventional U.S. beef system. So there are ways in which regionally specific production systems might have some environmental benefits depending on where you are in the region. Something I will point out is that these systems tend to have a really high reliance on corn-based feeds. And so thinking about ways to improve the sustainability of those systems, I'm going to connect a lot of dots here. So we're going to talk about fruits and vegetables, we're going to talk about beef, and we're going to talk about food waste. So we did some work looking at whether food waste to feed could be a solution to further improve the sustainability of these dairy beef production systems in the Northeast. So we know that we can create, there's been animal science literature on creating a high energy feed that mimics corn in a lot of ways from retail food waste. That's not animal based, it's plant-based retail food waste. We have a really large potential supply of this in the northeastern United States because we have a lot of urban centers. And we have policy pushes to do this. So we have multiple states and New York City putting in landfill bans and trying to push alternative management of food waste. But that policy push is also encouraging development of anaerobic digesters for green energy. So we're sending a lot of our food waste to digesters now, and that pressure is really growing. So we asked the question, what happens if we feed that food waste to cattle instead of an anaerobic digester? And we found, this is a busy graph, but we found that there are net benefits of using food waste and animal feed in our context instead of putting it into an anaerobic digester for green energy. And what you see here, this was a consequential life cycle assessment. So we looked at benefits and costs of this kind of a shift. Everything that is above the zero line is an additional emission. Everything that's below is an emission savings. And a negative number means that we have an emission savings on global warming potential and acidification potential if we use this food waste as feed instead of fueling an anaerobic digester. So this is to say that using this kind of leftovers approach, thinking about leftovers in terms of leftovers from the dairy industry and leftovers from human consumption and retailing might have environmental benefits. And we should be really prioritizing recycling food waste into feed after reduction and recovery in our region. We need to further assess the feasibility of doing this. There's a lot of work to be done, and we can think about additional species like pigs and other animals that this could work well for. But this is just to put a different kind of circular economy spin on how we might think about transforming our systems in particular contexts to move towards sustainability. So the last thing I'll mention, moving from beef to produce, beef and food waste to produce. So I had mentioned the potential of local and regional systems to possibly increase fruit and vegetable consumption. And we can all agree that that is probably a goal of sustainable diets. We want folks to eat more fruits and vegetables. But we know that the production of many fruits and vegetables in this country is highly geographically concentrated. So Frank mentioned this and some of the externalities associated with concentrated agriculture. We have leafy greens, broccoli, celery, garlic, processing tomatoes, strawberries, and grapes. Incredible quantity of the foods that we produce in those categories come from California. And if we're thinking about shifting to sustainable diets, this is the resource requirements and emissions of the dietary guidelines of the Healthy U.S. Pattern. So if we think about water depletion and consumptive water use, fruits and vegetables, those are the red and green boxes here, fruits and vegetables are major contributors to water depletion in recommended diets. So as we think about folks shifting to more sustainable diets, we need to think about where that's going to happen. So increasing production in current production centers could exacerbate water stress or additional local environmental issues like smog or other issues that Frank mentioned in California. We know that geographically concentrated production is increasingly vulnerable under climate change. So droughts and fires and increasingly erratic weather patterns, having concentrated production likely means less resilience in the face of those shocks. And so I would put forward that we can think about local and regional as potential mechanisms here to think about how we could improve and increase production in sustainable ways and as potential mechanisms, although there's a lot of work and empirical research that needs to be done to understand the implications of doing something like this. This is essentially a hypothesis. So my questions for us moving forward as we think about research and collaboration in these spaces, how can we further integrate the potential contributions of these systems into sustainable diets in meaningful ways? So I'd mentioned having other folks in the room, maybe some sociologists who could help us think about the social and cultural potential of these alternative systems, what roles those might play in kind of transforming things towards sustainability. How can we think about our system's role in circular economies? So even going beyond the food system and thinking about waste management, well, it's part of the food system, but thinking how the food system intersects with other aspects of our economy and how we can try to create more circular systems in particular places and what role that might play for sustainability. What about resilience? I'd mentioned some hypotheses about how increasing, decentralizing production, increasing diversity of production might contribute to resilience. I think that's something that we need to study empirically, and I'd be really interested to talk with folks about how we could use integrated modeling approaches to try to understand the role that different kinds of systems could play in these spaces. And how do we understand other structural issues, the underlying economic and social systems that are part of the reason why we have the externalities that we have today? So I just wanted to conclude by saying that I don't think that local and regional food systems are the answer to all of our sustainability issues. I think it's going to take a lot of different approaches that we've been talking about here today. But I think it's important to mention that a really healthy, resilient food system would have really high functioning at a variety of scales. So we need all of these scales to be working together to have a healthy and resilient food system. And I think that is our big task. So thank you.